resources are accessible, and how we work with suppliers when we find out that there's some issues database e-content. Just to give you a bit of background, Shell have already mentioned that we have about 170,000 students, unique students on campus. That's mostly studying in a part-time capacity. And 23% of our students lives in the most developed areas in the UK. And we admit students who have one A-level or lower, so that's about 32% of our students. The key thing for us is that about over 27,000 of our student population have a disability. And that's roughly about 21.6% of our student population, the size of a small or a medium-sized university. And we have 1,400 students who are studying from a secure environment. So that could be prison, or it could be a secure hospital, or any other secure environments. And the key figure for us is the 27,800 disabled students, or those who chose to declare disability. This graph here shows you the breakdown of the disabilities in the university. So we work with various types of disabled students. You have the usual sight or visual impairments or hearing impairments. But there is a wide range of diseases. So there is a mobility one, there is learning difficulties. And if you think about it, all those would have, in one way or another, some issues with studying online. So let's take someone with mobility problems. They might not be able to use a mouse, so they have to use keyboard or tapping to get to online resources. If you look at someone with learning difficulties, let's say dyslexia, they may not like the articles in a column way. They might want it in like a whole A4 page for ease of read. They might not want it aligned, just aligned to one side or the other. So all these things we need to take into consideration when we are offering our e-content to students. And I did say that 21% of our entire student population are disabled, but that's also a breakdown into when you go to faculty. So even within STEM, about 20.5% of the students there have a disability. So it's kind of equal break between various faculties. So e-resources and accessibility. Fiona will be probably talking more about the work academic liaison librarians do with modules. But part of the work our academic liaison librarians do with modules is talk to them about what e-content that are suitable for the modules. What would be in their thinking as well, whether these resources are accessible or not. And usually our e-content, our academic liaison librarians will advise to use a certain article or a certain database, and then they would come back to our accessibility team and check whether they can ask whether this database or this article is accessible. And for that, what we do with them is we go through, we check the accessibility, we do test databases. We have certain criteria that platform or a supplier should meet in order to say that this database is accessible or not. So part of the work we do is doing the testing. We have library assistants and myself and Jerry, who's another librarian with us. We test the databases for various criteria. For example, whether you can tap through all the content and have access to it, whether a screen reader user can use it effectively, if the content within the database are not accessible, what's alternative, what we can do as an alternative. So Wendy, who's one of our librarians, she's with us here, asked me once to check a database for how we can make sure that the students who have an activity to do can access the database and perform that activity. So that's something we test for. What triggers testing is there are various things that can trigger database testing for us. So the academic liaison library can trigger testing. Also, when our e-content advisor tells that we are going to get access to a new database, we try to test it in time for that. And also we try to regularly test for databases, like every 2 years we run the test again to make sure that if there's any new platform change that it's still accessible. And once we've done the database testing, we two things happen. If there's no issues, fine, good, nothing need to be done. If there are some issues and there are works around, we can put some accessibility tips for students on this database, telling them, for example, if let's say the database has a special accessibility feature, we can advise them about this feature. Also, if there are issues then with the database, then we will communicate this to our e-content advisors, and they will be covering that to talk to the suppliers. One more thing we do with accessibility testing. Sometimes the academic liaison librarians will, or the module teams will be embedding some of our articles or ebooks into the content of the module. One thing we need to do that this particular resource, like this journal article or this ebook, is in itself accessible. So what we have a service where our library assistants will check if the contents are accessible. If it's accessible, there is nothing need to be done. If they are not accessible, then we will send it to someone called the technical testing team, or a team called the technical testing team, who will convert these documents, these articles, into an accessible format so they can put it in a Word document. If there are tables or images that are not, so you can't read them through a screen reader, or they don't have alternative text, they will put them into a more accessible format and then embed them into the module, so students with disability can actually access these documents and have the same experience as enabled body students. Dave. Dave, do you want to take from here?
Turn the mic on. Sorry, everyone. We collaborate with suppliers a lot on accessibility, and the e-content advisors and the library assistants work with the academic liaison librarians to make sure that we can use content in the way that we want to, and that's on a broader scope, whether it be needs for different types of students, etc. So how do we work with suppliers? We've been banging on really about accessibility for a very long time. I've been in this role 12 years, and we've been talking about it right at the very beginning, when perhaps other people weren't thinking about it in quite the same way. With our students, we know that there are going to be some resources that will never be accessible for the full range of students, but we need to make sure that most students can use it in the way that they need to. So what we do, we talk at account meetings about the needs of our students, about what it means to be a keyboard-only user. We give them the criteria that we use to make sure that our own information and module courses, etc., are accessible. We give them that template. We give them what we use ourselves. We talk to them then about how their product is working. And the interesting thing about many suppliers and publishers, and particularly account managers, is that they very rarely see their own product being used by anybody else. So what we've done is we test, we then rank the different issues that we might have found, and then we pass that on to the publisher. We say where something is going to literally stop a student using it, and we tell them what kind of student may have a problem with that. So, for example, we recently had worked with Oxford University Press, and once we'd started talking about accessibility, they asked if they could see what kind of problems things threw up. So we had our normal account manager come along and one of their development directors come along, and they suddenly realised that that was really, really powerful. So what we did, Jerry and Claire Grace went across to Oxford University Press and demonstrated, tested things in front of the team, in front of the developers, to show where perhaps a skip link for a student who's using a keyboard didn't work, or perhaps one of the things that often comes up are the little buttons that for social media may block the student moving further down the page. And what we do when we test is we look at the basic search, we look at the advanced search, and we look, as Hossam said, at being able to change the colours, the size of things, and use a screen reader. Now, what's really nice with NVDA, the free screen reader, is that people are starting to pick up on it more. But when we were using just JAWS, very often the publishers didn't understand how they would work. So we demonstrated this at OUP, and they came back to us later and they have worked on changing their whole process to make sure that accessibility is there in the design phase. Now, that's really important because then it runs through from the beginning instead of doing reactive or changing things afterwards is much more difficult. We've done this with Taylor and Francis as well in a different area. When we started converting articles, making sure they were accessible, we wanted to do this up front when the modules were being designed and produced. And at the time, it was a time when very much you had to go back to the publisher for each individual item each time and wait to get a response and an accessible copy. We worked with Taylor and Francis and explained what we wanted to do and why we wanted to do it, and guaranteed that it would only go to disabled students who had the right to use them, but they were happy to grant some conversion up front, which changed our process completely. We also make sure that we can talk to publishers alongside other universities. The more that universities can say that we have accessibility problems, it's very powerful to do that as a group. So we like to try, if we're invited to go to a library advisory board from a publisher, we will always ask what's happening with accessibility, where they're going with that, how it's moving forward. And where they're getting their information from. I think it's improved massively, and the more it improves, the less testing, in theory, we need to do. For example, I know Taylor and Francis have just shown that they've done a lot more on their accessibility front, and I know that that was part of their library advisory board. The same with Sage. When they were developing some of their new video products, they actually asked the library advisory board, what would we like? What did we need? And it was at a time when maybe a lot of the image databases, excuse me, didn't have closed captions, didn't have transcripts. So that worked really, really well. The thing we find most difficult is when there's a new platform change or a tweak, and that tweak changes everything. So in lots of ways we can't sit on our laurels and think that something's been checked and it's going to stay the same, because things do change very, very regularly. But when we find that change, if we can all feed that back to the publishers, it really does help. The other interesting example, which are the smaller publishers, they are usually very, very grateful for help with this, to understand how their resource is being used, and they may have smaller companies that develop for them that don't have the kind of experience that we do with our students using resources. That's been very beneficial with some of the smaller publishers that have maybe quite niche products in areas such as nursing. The other, as Hossam said, the other thing that we do as we purchase a product, we do that with our disabled students in mind. Now, it doesn't mean, excuse me, it doesn't mean that everything is going to be accessible for everyone. For example, some of the medical imaging databases are very difficult for keyboard-only users or perhaps a screen reader. They have got better as they've gone on. But at the time, being very visual was fantastic for our dyslexic students. So it's really being aware of those issues and where we need to put some top tips up to make sure that we have some workarounds. The other thing that the academic liaison librarians do is check through those activities and make sure that the resources that are used are good enough. So, for example, in arts they were using some images, and the image information was not as good as they needed. So, being aware of, even if there's something there, is it quite what the students need is really important. Some of the archives are difficult. We test platforms and then we test the content. If it's scanned content, it can be really difficult. A lot of the publishers now are looking to make this much better. And I know that Wiley have been looking at the new archives that they've put out, and they are far more accessible than the older resources that we've got. And I think that's the challenge to the publishers. It's working with them to try and see where we can make that a bit better. Finally, as I said, I think being involved as a whole group of librarians and feeding back to the publishers is invaluable. Groups like Sheriff, where you can go back to a publisher as lots of different libraries about things that we've found are more difficult, and being supportive and encouraging them to change really builds that relationship going forward. That's what we do. We do build it into our procurement and trial phases, but it isn't the final decision, but it does take a big place in whether we purchase a product or not. Thank you very much.
Yeah, as Bev said, we don't just do it because there is a legal obligation to deliver uh, these accessible materials. We do it because these students need to have the same or substantially the same experience as enabled body students. And also remember that with the new regulation coming in September, we are, as public bodies, responsible for third-party materials that we putting on our website, responsible for its accessibility, or at least telling people whether we checked its accessibility or not. Just moving on. Sorry.
Sorry, yeah, carry on. Sorry, Hossam.
No, I was going to move to the next slide if you want to cover something first.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
So what we've mentioned earlier are the stuff we do proactively before things go to the students in terms of the materials we have. However, sometimes you would have students still coming to you for various reasons. So there are different things we offer for our disabled students from all faculties, not only the STEM. So there is the help desk, where most of our help desk staff have been shown how to use NVDA. So at least when they are dealing with someone who has a disability, like a visual impairment, or someone who prefer to use a screen reader, they would be able to have the same experience as their students and be able to advise them correctly where to go on a database. Ideally, also, we would like the students to be independent. So basically, we we provide online training to them, and sometimes with disabled students we provide one-to-one service if they want that. But it's sometimes not always possible to get them to be independent. Try your best, but sometimes there is difficulty, especially if, for example, if the database is extremely inaccessible. If sometimes that's the case. So we provide supported literature search for the students. Basically, uh, they will come to us asking, "Can you do this for us? Can you do this search for me?" We will liaise with the faculty or with the relevant tutor and ask their permission. And if they are happy for us, then we will run the search. We only run the search, and the students then have to pick the relevant articles or materials they want. Uh, and then if they are accessible, that's fine. If these materials they found for the or we found for them, or if they found materials that by their independent work and they found that it is not accessible, then what we do, there is two things they can do. We have a service called Census Access, and I'm not sure how many of you heard of this service, but basically uh, it's a self-service system, an online-based system where you can put the inaccessible document or the inaccessible website and then choose which format you want it in. It could be Word document or it could be PDF, an accessible PDF, and then it will, or even an audio format, and then it will send it back to you within 15 minutes, converted to an accessible format. The, the downside to this service is an automated one. So if the quality of the original document is really bad, let's say if it's just a mere scan of an old book, then the outcome will not be good. Um, Ideally, we want to push the students towards that service because it's quick. Alternatively, if it fails, then we can convert these documents for the students on one by one basis. So, for example, they will send it to us, say this is not accessible. Then we will send it to the technical testing the same way we did with the articles we read in modules. They will convert it into accessible format and send it back to the students. So these are a couple of things we do. We also have a pilot for our RNIB Bookshare where the students can get the original file of a book if part of their studies from the RNIB Bookshare, and then they can convert it into a more accessible document. At the moment, it's a pilot service because we want to see whether it's beneficial to students or not. And then the next thing we do, uh, our online training sessions, we make them accessible by providing the slides and by providing the uh, and by providing subtitles to them and transcripts. Also, we did run we run several times every year. We run a session on how to make things accessible. So it's not the accessibility of a database, but for example, how to change the background color for text or how to reflow the text. And sometimes how to which best format to use. Is it a PDF or a EPUB? So we go through with this with them. It's about a 45-minute session just to and help them study online rather than how to search a database or how to search the library website. And finally, I've mentioned already the accessibility tips um, as well.
Hi, can I pick up on a couple of the question and
Yeah,
answer? So, Sarah Field, you asked, are you able to comment on how engaged academics are with the need for considering accessibility when selecting resources? One of the things that with our nature of being online is when during module production, the module team, which are the academics and the learning designers and the academic liaison librarians, they do have to consider accessibility. It really runs through everything we do. I'm not saying that we get it right, but for example, we not only have, the disabled students team, we have an alternative formats team, we have a cross-faculty accessibility working group, C4, where the accessibility champions that are based in each faculty come together and discuss and literally work on different topics for whatever we need. We have a group called SIGA that runs right across the university. That's securing greater accessibility, and that has in it not only academics and faculties, but like our people services, our HR team, our training, our development. So in that way, everybody is very aware of accessibility, and with 21% of our students, it's a big group. That's a fifth of our university. The other way that it fits in is if we are using content that is not subscribed by the library. I'm part of a team which is content licensing and IP information, intellectual property, and the module teams work with the other side, the intellectual property team, and ask for rights permissions for that other content. And at that point, they will also prompt for, have you checked accessibility? They will ask for the module teams if they're using a website, whether they have checked for accessibility. I'm not saying that it always works, but it does mean that that question is always in the air. And the SIGA team actually is there for advice if they, for example, are trying to do something. We've had something recently where it's a software package. It's not working as well as we wanted to. They want to use a particular textbook. It's not very accessible, and that team there which includes the technical testing team and ourselves, they will pull in who they need to try and give advice on that kind of thing. And at the end of that, it may be that we go back to the publisher, or it may be that they give advice to change something quite radically, but making sure that the students do have the same kind of study experience as much as possible. I hope that answers the question. So they are fairly engaged. We do have quite a new team in some of the faculties, and that is something new for them, but the academic liaison librarians are in with those teams all the time, and that does definitely help.
I'm just going to answer Adam's question about the 24/7 chat. So yeah, it is literally 24/7. Between 9 and 5 Monday to Friday, the librarian and the library assistant on campus respond to the chats from students. Outside these hours and during holidays, um, we are part of the OCLC, or now it answers. Uh, it's outsourced outside these hours, and so the chat will go into professional librarians in the United States, and some of them are based in the UK as well, who will be able to answer our students' questions. Uh, they, they are really good. They kind of respond to large portion of these questions. The only time where they can't really respond is where it requires login to our OU systems, and then that's where they refer them back to us.
Hossam's answered a couple more questions. The free screen reader that I mentioned is NVDA, and there's some really good YouTube videos on how to use it as well, actually. And data is showing that it's almost 50-50. I think it's like 51%, 49% students using JAWS or using NVDA. So that's a good one to look at.
There is the question about what online training sessions we use, what tools we use. What we use for our online training is the same Adobe Connect you are using right now. So we use the same thing with the students, and it's used also during tutorials with the tutors. So we use the same system.
Sarah Hammond asked, it would be really helpful to share the testing criteria. I'm sure we can do that. Right in the very beginning, actually, we shared all that criteria up to JISC, and when they were doing the ebook platforms, crowdsource, they used that. And also, with the Aspire project, we believe very much in sharing where we can and helping. Our testing at the moment is a new 4-step testing. It's still quite I was going to say an onerous task. It's not. It's between 1 and 3 hours to look at a resource. But if you're using that very consistently with students, it's definitely well worth doing. And Hossam has said that we can share that. I don't know if there are any other questions. Okay. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Bevan and Hossam. That was really